Good evening. It is a privilege to be here at this great university, to speak for a very short time about a topic that I find utterly fascinating. It's actually captivated my imagination. So I was asked to speak about mindfulness in science, but to really explore the possibility of balance between two modes of scientific inquiry. My nom de plume, the one that I use as an author and translator for many, many years, is B. Alan Wallace. I've always gone by my middle name. But if you juggle those letters around, B. Alan Wallace, it comes out as Balance Walla. And in Hindi, a walla is one who is marketing or selling balance. And so I think maybe I was intended to emphasize this over the course of my life. Of course, it's not something simply that I teach, but I try to embody, to practice as much as I can. And so the issue here is balance, because my own sense, my subjective impression is that our civilization of modernity, I don't use the word Western civilization much anymore because it's global. Western civilization is in Singapore and Ulaanbaatar, Hong Kong, Shanghai, Sydney, and so forth. It's everywhere, a civilization of modernity. But my sense is that the civilization of which we are, the recipients but also the promoters, is wildly out of balance. And then you judge for yourself as I continue. Out of balance, especially since the last 400 years, this 400 years of triumph of science. I've studied science, I admire science, I love science, and I've loved studying the history of science, the evolution of science, and I would say that modern science as we understand it did not begin with Copernicus as much as Galileo. He was the first full scientist. Copernicus was a brilliant mathematician, but he didn't prove anything, because his theory was rather more or less as good as the one that was already there. Mathematically, but Galileo was the one that brought the technology to bear. He was the one that didn't invent the telescope, but he refined it and used it scientifically for the first time. He also devised other technology for measuring, making very, very specific, very precise measurements to determine whether balls rolling down a ramp went at constant velocity or accelerated. And so he was the whole package. He was a trained mathematician, he taught mathematics. He developed his own technology and he used it. He devised hypotheses and he put them to the test. He was the first full scientist. And Einstein himself said he's the father of modern science. I think Einstein probably got that right. And one element that sets Galileo apart from really everybody that preceded him, even you, including your beloved Tycho Brahe, who did make precise observations but had no telescope, is that he introduced this practice of rigorous observation. And what he was interested in, he could have been interested in anything, but what he was interested in is celestial phenomena and terrestrial phenomena, kinematics, dynamics. But he brought in this technology and the ability to make precise, quantitative observations of what he was seeking to understand. That had never been done before, not like he had done it. And that introduction of this radically empirical approach, being willing to put on the line even hypotheses or assumptions that had been around for 1,400 years, namely that the Earth was in the center, that really set him apart. And he did trigger the modern scientific revolution, and more specifically, the revolution in the physical sciences. So that was 1609 when he published The Starry Messenger and really started modern science in this way. 150 years later, 250, 1609 to 1859, 250 years later, Darwin published his great piece, Origin of Species, and again he introduced to biology what Galileo, I would suggest, introduced to physics, and that is sustained something like 25 years of very, very precise observations, very extensively in the UK or England at that time, but of course his great voyage around the world, making very precise, extensive observations, and on that basis, developing his brilliant theory, which is proven to be have enormous explanatory power. And so he triggered the first and only revolution in the biological sciences. Now, when I speak of a revolution, whether the revolution of modern science, revolution in physics, revolution in the biological sciences, precisely what I mean by that is once you've understood the implications of the discoveries having been made, specifically, for example, Galileo discovering the phases of Venus. The phases of Venus, that was the first definitive evidence that Ptolemy was wrong. There's no way that the Earth could be in the center and that Venus could have phases. You cannot view the starry night or the planet in the same way ever again. There's no going back. We can't choose, maybe we're wrong. Maybe we can go back to an Earth-centered universe. There's no going back. right? That's a revolution. Your way, not just a belief system, but your way of viewing reality has shifted in an irreversible way because of some dramatic empirical discovery that's been made that changes everything. And Darwin did the same thing. Until him, it was widely assumed that species were static. Static. And now we know, because of his discoveries, his theory, and then genetics and so on, genetic mutation, adaptation, and so forth, you can no longer look at the human species in the same way. You can't look at other species in the same way. There is no going back. You can ignore the evidence if you like, cloister yourself off, believe that the Earth is still only 10,000 years old or younger. You can do that, but this means you have to close your eyes. So we've had one and actually two revolutions in the physical sciences. The second one with Niels Bohr, with Heisenberg, Einstein, Max Planck, and so on. That revolution isn't finished. There are fundamental questions like the measurement problem that have not been solved. What's the role of the observer? What's the role of measurement? So it's definitely a revolution. Assumptions of classical physics were overthrown, will never go back. You can never go back to Newtonian physics as the final story. Absolute space, time, matter, and energy. No going back. It was a revolution, but it's still evolving. Fundamental questions remain. But then we come, having looked at the physical, two revolutions. The biological, one revolution. We come to the mind sciences. Oh, they began in roughly 1875. Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, William James at Harvard, and others. And so they wanted to turn the study of the mind, about which philosophers had been thinking for a very long time, wanted to turn this into an experimental science. William James was one of the pioneers of this, and William James's proposal, his strategy was three-part strategy, threefold strategy. He made a plea in one paper: let us treat mental phenomena, emotions, perceptions, dreams, attention, memory, intelligence, and so forth. Let us treat them as natural phenomena, which means we should approach them as we have every other category of natural phenomena, which means we should carefully observe the phenomena we're seeking to understand, and therefore introspection, he said, should be used first, foremost, and always as the primary avenue for investigating the mind as we subjectively experience it. But being a very radically non-dogmatic person, William James, who died in 1910, he also said, but by all means we should study the mind indirectly by studying the neurocorrelates, the way the brain contributes to subjective experience. We should also study behavior, because we can draw many sound inferences about the mind based upon questionnaires, facial expression, behavior of human behavior, rats, pigeons, and so forth. And so therefore we should have a triadic approach. Study the mind indirectly by way of behavioral expressions, indirectly by way of the brain correlates, but directly by introspection, which means that introspection needs to be honed, refined, made more sophisticated so it becomes a reliable mode of observation, which generally it isn't. So three approaches. Introspection being primary, right? This so-called introspectionist movement began about his time, 1875, but that movement pretty much died and has never been resurrected in 1910. John Watson, the rise of behaviorism, scuttled introspection, threw it in the trash bin and torched it, and also said, let's not talk about subjective experience. Let's talk about stimulus and response. But subjective, it's too airy-fairy, it's too non-scientific. Let's get back to what we're good at, and that is studying the objective, the physical, and the quantifiable. So let's stick with that and not go into this mushy area of trying to look at emotions and thoughts and dreams and so forth. So William James, took a Galilean approach to the study of the mind, but that was abandoned by the behaviorists, then the cognitive psychologists, and now absolutely by the neuroscientists. Focus on behavior, focus on brain. Introspection remains where it was 115 years ago. There has been no progress. And as far as I know, I would love it if you can tell me that there is a psychology department in any major university in modernity where introspection plays a significant role in education and in research into the nature of the mind. I don't know of any. Something's been left out. So a stalled evolution, no revolution, and that is, I say there's no resulting revolution in the mind sciences since 1875. I'm not saying that as a pejorative statement, like it's all been a waste of time, you haven't learned anything. Of course, enormous amount of knowledge, insights, discoveries have been made, but if we look at fundamental assumptions about the nature of the mind, its relationship to the brain, the body, and so forth, those fundamental assumptions in the late 19th century are pretty much still there. I think it would be very hard to argue that there's been anything remotely like a revolution in the mind sciences comparable to Darwin's revolution, Galileo's revolution, or that of Max Planck, Werner Heisenberg, and Einstein. That would be a tough sell. I don't believe it. Many insights? Yes. Revolution? No. Maybe it's because we didn't follow the route of Galileo and Darwin. This epistemological hierarchy. I'm very interested in watching the media coverage of science reporting and so forth. It seems to me wildly imbalanced. Naturalism. It's a nice word for materialism or physicalism. It's what materialists like to call themselves, naturalists. It sounds very sweet. I'd much rather be a naturalist than a materialist. It sounds kind of vulgar. But what is meant by naturalism, and there are different varieties, of course, but naturalism is the notion that the whole of reality really consists of configurations of mass energy and their emergent properties. Everything really fundamentally boils down to space-time, matter, and energy, and then the emergent properties, the functions of mass energy. And so that's a belief. Everything boils down to mass energy and its emergent properties. It's very convenient because that assumes that everything boils down to what scientists are good at looking at. How convenient. And so I've seen some writings from very, very ardent materialists, which I think is more accurate, or physicalists, that's accurate, or naturalists. And it's often assumed that since they are atheist, since they're materialist, since they're reductionist, that makes them rational. Because you believe this and you speak out of that metaphysical framework, that ontological framework, that makes you more rational than if you question that framework. That's interesting. In other words, reason is subservient to a dogma, a belief system, which has, by the way, never been scientifically demonstrated. Do you know of any study that's shown there's nothing in the universe that exists apart from matter, energy, and their derivative properties? I've never seen such a study. It's simply a belief. And so reason is reasonable as long as it conforms to naturalism, but when reason operates outside of that framework, it becomes suspect of being airy-fairy, or I heard slappy-dappy hippy-dippy. I just learned that one. Slappy-dappy hippy-dippy. I was just at a conference with a bunch of corporate executives a few days ago. And then what type of experience counts? Clearly, science has not moved away from empiricism, otherwise it would no longer be science. But what type of experience counts? What type of experience can we say is scientific? If you see a UFO, for example, does that count? If you have an out-of-body experience, does that count? Does that count? If you have some experience of maybe precognition, you have some premonition, and lo and behold, it's true. It turns out to be true. Does that count? What kind of experience counts is factored in. If you go into deep meditative state and you make some discoveries as you're meditating, does that count? And I would suggest, well, no, your experience has to accord with reason, and reason has to accord with the beliefs of materialism. And so that screens out a lot of experience, but even empirical evidence that doesn't conform. I've seen this a lot. So this naturalism, pretty much since the time of Darwin, around the last 150 years or so, this scientific materialism, naturalism, has really dominated virtually all of modern science. If you conform to that, you're okay. If you challenge that, you might have a hard time getting tenure or getting published. So, what's been a result of that? And I find this very interesting, this point. All the psychologists know what a blind spot is. That is where the optic nerve touches the back of the retina. We seem to have a homogeneous full field of the visual field here. But in fact, there are two little areas that are no signal, empty, no information, right? But then what does the brain mind do? It covers it over. So if you're looking at a pink wall, it covers it over with pink. It's what's it called? Photoshops. It photoshops your visual field. It fills it in with the adjacent color or what have you. It gives you the impression there's knowledge there, but there isn't. It just covers it over with what you do know and doesn't show you what you don't know. I'm using that as a metaphor. Consciousness. How does consciousness fit into a naturalist view of reality or vision of reality? When number one, there's something like 250 definitions of consciousness, and there's no consensus on any of them scientifically. That's a problem. If you can't define it, how do you study it? How would you know when you're studying it if nobody can agree on what the definition is? So that's a problem. This is since 1875. They've had a lot of time and not even a definition of consciousness. Now you bring out all your array of technology, and it's marvelous technology. The EEG, the MRI, and so many other types of measures. But in fact, we know to this day there is no objective means of detecting consciousness in anything. Insect eating plants, when they're devouring the insect, do they go, that was tasty? You know, do they have any experience, insect eating plants? Well, we don't know. I don't know. When does a fetus, when the egg and sperm come together, and the fetus is growing, when is it a passenger and not simply a body part? If it's a body part, you take it out if you don't like it, like, you know, extra blood. When is a fetus a sentient being? When does it, looking back, when does it have experience, consciousness? The answer is we don't know. If a person goes into a coma, goes brain dead, when does consciousness stop? The simple answer is we don't know how to measure that objectively. That's tough if you're trying to have a science of consciousness and you can't define it or measure it. The NCC, the neurocorrelates of consciousness. I know one of the men who's leading that charge. He's no longer at Caltech, but he had his own laboratory. I visited him there, had 11 hours of conversation. And this is Christoph Koch. And he was looking for the neurocorrelates of consciousness. What is the minimal amount of neuronal activity that is necessary for generating consciousness? Of course, that's assuming that the brain does generate consciousness, an untested hypothesis. But it's a working hypothesis. So what's the minimal amount of neuronal activity that is necessary for subjective experience to occur? And the answer is they've never found it. They spent decades, really smart people. Christoph Koch is a sharp cookie, but never found it. As a fetus is growing, or whether it's in a plant or a primitive organism like a hydra or a lizard or a snail, what are the necessary and sufficient causes of consciousness? We're assuming that sodium is not conscious. We're assuming perhaps that a single-celled organism is not conscious. But how complex does the organism need to be to enable the emergence of consciousness? And the answer is we don't know. How is it the brain generates consciousness? How does it even influence consciousness? How does the placebo effect work? I've studied it, I've corresponded with some world experts. How is it that a mere belief, faith, confidence, trust, expectation can influence your body in very specific ways exactly as you expect? You don't just feel better, but it triggers certain neural mechanisms that bring about exactly what you expect to have. So a friend of mine is head of R&D at a major pharmaceutical industry, and a company, and he said about half the benefit you get from pharmaceutical drugs across the board, half the benefit is from the placebo effect, which means they really should charge 50% of whatever they're charging, because you're doing all the rest, right? And so we've been left in the dark. That's the simple point. When it comes to consciousness, it's just not physical. It's just not objective and is not quantifiable, and therefore, for all the strengths of our objective science, it's left us totally in the dark when it comes to consciousness. The problem with a blind spot is, as we go back to that analogy, is that we don't see two black holes in our visual field. That would be nice to know what we don't know. But it covers over, right? The Photoshop effect. Well, this is what's happened in modern philosophy of mind, modern psychology, neuroscience to a very large extent. John Searle, I've debated with him years ago, very eminent philosopher of mind in the United States, professor of philosophy at UC Berkeley. He makes a statement which is representative of many thinkers in the field. He's addressing the mind-body problem. There is a simple solution, I'm so relieved, a simple solution to the mind-body problem. And what is that? This solution has been available to any educated person since serious work began on the brain, nearly a century ago. And in a sense, we all know it to be true. Isn't that a relief? I thought it was a problem, and it turns out not to be. And what is the solution? Don't hold us here, let us know. Here it is. Mental phenomena are caused by neurophysiological processes in the brain and are themselves features of the brain. That's it, huh? That's widely accepted, not universally, but it's widely accepted. But I guess I either don't exist or I'm not educated or I'm just too stupid to get it, because I don't find that compelling at all. I've studied physics. I have studied physics. And I'll give you a universal statement from physics. In the known universe, every time you find any physical entity whatsoever, if you're observing the function of that entity, you can also observe the entity simultaneously. Moreover, every function of a physical entity is itself physical. No exceptions in the whole of the natural world as far as we know. When you observe the function of a physical entity, you can also observe the physical entity. Now, when you observe the brain, you can't see any subjective experience at all. When you introspectively observe your thoughts, emotions, and so forth, you can't see any brain anywhere. The brain is a physical organism. If subjective experience is truly a function of the brain, it should be physical. That means it should be observable, measurable scientifically, and it's not. In other words, that's an article of faith being presented as a scientific fact, which I call pseudoscience. But it's mainstream. It may be true, but he's presenting it as a known truth. In fact, it's only a hypothesis that runs counter to everything we know about physical phenomena and their functions. In other words, that's an exceptional claim with no exceptional evidence behind it. I love the history of science, and Lord Kelvin is just delightful. He was brilliant, great physicist of the late 19th century, one of the last great classical physicists. And he said in 1891, this was, 4 years after the Michelson-Morley experiment demonstrated that there is no ether. That was in 1887. Definitive, incontrovertible, irreversible proof that the ether does not exist, 1887 in the United States. Lord Kelvin said 4 years later, there's one thing we're sure of, and that is the reality and substantiality of the luminiferous ether. That's exactly what had been disproven 4 years earlier. Quite interesting. Well, they didn't have internet, I know, but really. He was most certain of that. One thing we're sure of, luminiferous ether. Some physical medium throughout space, which is actually the medium through which light travels and propagates its interference patterns, the properties of waves. Absolutely certain. Why? Because it should exist. According to the assumptions of classical physics, it had to exist. Not because they had any evidence, they didn't. In fact, by then there was incontrovertible evidence to the contrary, but it should exist based on their beliefs. The mind should be physical based on the beliefs, but there's no evidence that the mind is physical. He says then, 9 years later, this was really one of his famous statements, there is nothing new to be discovered in physics now, all that remains is more and precise measurement. Happily, that was the same year that Max Planck started the quantum mechanics revolution. 5 years later, Einstein started relativity, advanced quantum mechanics, and everything was different. So he got the year right, but he got the fact exactly wrong. So it's very easy to have assumptions that are disengaged from the empirical reality, and we have Einstein rounding off this conversation about the ether. 1938, all assumptions concerning ether led nowhere. That was on the gravestone of ether. It was believed very widely by the best scientists in the 19th century, and it was wrong, because there was never any evidence that it existed. It's something simply that should have existed given their metaphysical beliefs. So I am a naturalist. I love the empiricism of naturalism. I love looking for causality within the world rather than appealing to supernatural intervention, mysteries for the sake of mysteries. And so Occam's razor was used to great effect in the rise of modern science, just scraping off assumptions, like the Ptolemaic assumption that the earth is in the center, scraping off assumption after assumption and replacing assumptions with empirical inquiry that may overturn centuries of assumption. Like the notion that if a big heavy ball dropped off the Tower of Pisa would travel faster than a little small ball. True until Galileo actually watched. He actually went to the top of the Tower of Pisa and saw that's not true. And so it is vain, says Occam's razor, the principle vain to do with more assumptions what can be done with fewer assumptions. So scrape them all off and see what's left. So what I'm suggesting here is that Occam's razor was very, very useful to enable the rise of modern science, a return to radical empiricism, a questioning of assumptions that were held by the mainstream, held for centuries, but actually were wrong. So if we take Occam's razor, we apply it to the insistence that all states of consciousness are emergence properties or functions of the brain, which is an assumption that's never been proven. It's just widely accepted. And you're considered to be airy-fairy by many people if you consider there might be some type of brain-independent mind. You're called then a dualist, which means you must be living in the 17th century with Descartes, which must mean you must be brain dead. But that's simply an assumption. What would happen if we just scraped out that assumption and returned to the evidence? If we added what was banished in 1910 from John Watson and through B.F. Skinner and so forth, if we added rigorous first-person inquiry to the mind sciences, and that is introduce introspection, but not leaving it at folk psychology, refining it, honing it, so it becomes actually a rigorous mode of observation. What might we gain? So it's a rhetorical question, but it's a real question. which has been lingering there for more than 100 years. So now I jump out of our civilization to the wonderful discovery that we're not the only civilization on the planet. Something often overlooked in modern academia. But we're not the only ones. So we go back 4,000 years ago to classical India, where there were these Indian countercultural truth seekers. They were called Shramanas. People would set off into lives of utter simplicity, a la Henry David Thoreau and others, in order to probe the nature of mind, discover the nature of mind, consciousness itself. And they, long before Buddha appeared, about 2,500 years ago, these early contemplatives in India, refined like I think no one else on the planet, including the Greeks, the Romans, and so on, learned how to develop attention skills to extraordinary degrees. It's called samadhi. Highly focused, bright, clear, knowing, focused attention. They called it samadhi. That was hundreds of years before the Buddha. So by the time he came along, roughly 2,500 years ago, when young Prince Gautama set out on his own pursuit of truth, he took a pre-existing technology, really. A technology of learning how to really focus your attention, including focusing your attention introspectively. And he used this samadhi as Galileo used a telescope that had already been around, but used it in an unprecedented way. Gautama the Buddha used pre-existing samadhi and used it in an unprecedented way. Rather than using meditation simply as a way to find inner peace, tranquility, transcendence, maybe God, he said, well, why don't we actually investigate the phenomena of the mind? And so he used samadhi with intelligence, with investigation to explore states of consciousness and their objects, and in Buddhism that's called vipassana, or insight meditation. And this phrase crops up a lot in his teachings, in all traditions. The mind that is established in equipoise, which is another term for balance, comes to know reality as it is. And that is when we come to a state of equipoise, as free as possible from the projections of our assumptions, the illusions of knowledge, superimpositions, and so forth. We can scrape those away with Occam's razor and try to look very carefully, rigorously, directly at the phenomena themselves. We might actually come and discover what's happening when it comes to the mind. So in Buddhist contemplative practice, and this is what I've been studying and practicing for about 45 years by now, there are two faculties that we all already have, and which now, the first one, mindfulness, has really become in vogue over the last 10 years or so. You may have seen it was on the cover of Time magazine. It's everywhere in psychological journals. It's in business journals. Mindfulness has become quite the fad. Mindfulness. It's, of course, defined in different ways, but I'm using a definition here that's about at least 1,500 years old, which is not the right definition, but it's proven to be useful for 1,500 years. Mindfulness, as I'm using the term now, is this ability we already have. It can be simply refined and honed, a faculty of sustaining attention voluntarily and continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness, without distraction. In other words, you can really stay focused for a sustained period on whatever you wish to attend to. It may be outward, as Galileo with his telescope, looking for a sustained period. Not so easy to discover that Jupiter has moons. You can't just look at it and say, oh, there's little dots around the big dot. They're probably background stars. But if you keep on watching, you find those little dots are moving around the big dot, and lo and behold, you've made a discovery of moons. But that takes mindfulness. You have to sustain your focus. And introspection, more commonly called metacognition in psychology, insofar as it's referred to at all, is our ability to monitor, to observe, to monitor our own mental states, mental processes, our emotions, desires, thoughts, to monitor our dreams. But as we are training the attention, developing mindfulness, it is by means of introspection that we recognize when the attention is getting distracted, carried off, agitated, and so forth, mind wandering. It's introspection that alerts us to it. Beep, 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 come back. And it's also introspection when we start to space out, get dull, lose clarity. It's with introspection that we recognize, you're spacing out here. Bring it back. So like a sailor trimming the sails on a sailboat, of course, then we'll learn how to trim the sails of attention, to develop in an ongoing fashion greater stability, greater clarity of attention, opening the possibility of introspection being part of the repertoire, not replacing anything. It doesn't replace MRI or EEG or questionnaires or behavioral studies. We're going back to William James's very non-dogmatic and actually very balanced approach. Embrace everything that's happened for the last 135 years, or 140 years now. Embrace all of that, it's all good, but introduce the one factor that's missing. Rigorous introspection, the first-person perspective, and don't simply dismiss it as non-existent, which happens, or dismiss it as folk psychology, or somehow intrinsically illusory. But there are legitimate objections to introspection. It gives a lot of people the creeps. It's so subjective. You're looking at your own thoughts, your moods, your perceptions, your dreams, your emotions, and so forth, and it's so private. It's so not public. It's so not third person. How can it possibly be scientific? These are legitimate qualms. There has to be some good reason why a lot of intelligent people have completely banned it or marginalized it for more than a century. So here's the first qualm. We'll deal with these quickly because there's more to come. And that is introspection. Well, whatever you see is unstable and it's impossible to verify. If I tell you right now that I'm thinking of peaches, right, fresh peaches, delicious, yummy peaches, how on earth do you know whether I know what I'm talking about? Am I deceiving you? You're going to study my brain? Maybe I can trick my brain. How do you know? If I tell you that I'm feeling anything, how do you know? You just want to go back and study behavior, but then basically you're not believing me at all. So it's unstable. Clearly there's subjective bias in our own introspection. Clearly it's not so easy anyway to verify when somebody makes an introspective claim. Now here's the silliest one. But I've heard it, that's why I include it. And that is meditation or introspective observations by way of meditation. This is useful only for understanding meditative states, but not ordinary or pathological mental states. Well, anybody who's meditated for a while knows that when you meditate, you don't just have meditative states coming up. You have lust coming up, and sadness, and agitation, and boredom, and low self-esteem, and paranoia, and anxiety, and everything else, including just ridiculously almost pathological states, as well as really ridiculous mundane states. In other words, you get the whole spectrum. So the notion only meditative states arise when you meditate is, well, okay, that's a person who's never meditated and doesn't know what the hell he's talking about. But now here's a big one, and this was very, very serious in the so-called introspectionist movement of Western psychology, and that is introspection is subject to contamination by theory. That was one of the major reasons given for the demise of introspectionism as a school of philosophy, that subjects working in a certain lab would follow the instructions of the director of the lab, who had his or her, usually it was his, beliefs, pet theories, and so forth, and lo and behold, the subjects performing the experiment tended to confirm the theories and so forth of the director of the lab. They wanted to please. And then one lab refuted another lab because they're following professors with different predilections, different biases, and people then say, oh yes, I saw just what you wanted me to see. Do I get an A? Do I get a good grade? So this is a serious issue. When we're making subjective observations, that our beliefs, our prejudices, our unquestioned assumptions can actually condition, alter, or bias our perceptions themselves. And now everybody who understands psychology knows that's true for every observation we ever make. Introspection is not unique. Any observation at all can be biased by our beliefs, our assumptions, our transference, projections, uncritical beliefs, uncritically assessed beliefs, and so forth. So yes, it's a problem, but if that's a problem, then it's a problem for all observation, not only introspective one. The notion, and this is very widely held by the limited materialists, like by behaviorists and so forth, and that is when you're introspecting, that all you're seeing are illusions. What really occurs, according to people like Daniel Dennett, Patricia Churchland, and others, is what's really there is only the brain activity. That's what's real. So if you're experiencing something else, well, that's just an illusion, not to be taken seriously. Why? They didn't answer. They just kind of like, believe me. It's like the Groucho Marx statement, who are you going to believe, me or your very own eyes? Groucho Marx, I love it. All of our observations are illusory. As I gaze over at your shirt, your striped green and blue shirt, I'm seeing the colors of the shirt as an attribute over there, 5 meters away. That's what I'm seeing, the colors of your shirt over there, as if the molecules of your shirt are actually blue and green. They're not, are they? There's no such thing as a blue molecule. And if there were, how would I know about them apart from the photons coming to my eyes? But there, I've studied physics. Photons aren't blue. There's no such thing as a blue photon. And no part of my visual cortex turns blue either. If it does, I'm seriously ill. Right? So where's this blue? It appears to be over there, and that's an illusion. The colors that seem to be out there, it's an illusion. The sounds that appear out there, it's sound traveling through space. It's an illusion. Sound doesn't travel through space. Vibrations in the atmosphere travel through space. Sound is generated independent upon the auditory cortex. It doesn't travel through space. But sound, I hear the sound coming from way over there. No, it's not. The sound is generated right here. It's an illusion. So yeah, there's an illusion, but come on, all of our perceptions are illusory. So that shouldn't discount it. This is an interesting one from the Freudians, and it's a serious one, and that is when we introspect, our observations are subject to concealment and misrepresentation by unconscious mental processes and motivations. That nasty subconscious getting in there and twisting, distorting, obscuring, and so forth. Very true. That one's true. That one doesn't blow away. But then contemplatives have known about this for centuries and centuries and centuries, and they've addressed this. Effectively or not, well, then you have to meditate and see. Can you ameliorate, can you decrease the subconscious distorting influences of the subconscious? Finally, one of my favorite ones, since I've studied physics, is when you introspect, when you observe a mental process, the very fact of observing it influences that which you're observing. You observe an emotion, watch what happens to your emotion. Observe a desire, watch what happens to the desire. There's an entanglement between what you're observing and your observation of it. As soon as you observe it, you're already altering it. Therefore, it's not objective. Therefore, it's not scientific. That's good if you've never heard of quantum mechanics. Because in quantum mechanics, that's the name of the game. You cannot observe any elementary particle without influencing it. You'll never know what it's like independent of measurement. It's always tweaked, modified. The probability function collapses. You may not even have a particle before the measurement. It's an open question. So that one, well, again, if it's no good for introspection, then you've just dismissed all of quantum mechanics, because that problem has not gone away. So we turn introspectively to the study of the mind, the observation, the exploration of the mind, and I would suggest it has multiple dimensions. The first one is incontrovertible, the embodied mind, the mind that we experience from day to day, including our conscious and unconscious mental processes, our emotions, thoughts, memories, desires, intelligence, the whole bandwidth of subjective experience, which William James suggested this is what psychologists should be studying. Not just behavioral expression, not just neural correlates. Why don't you study the mind, which is what we experience first person? And of course, this embodied mind, a man's mind, a woman's mind, child, elderly, Danish, American, and so forth, conditioned by biology, genetics, neurophysiology, language, acculturation, conditioned by so many things. This is the embodied mind. And of course, it can be studied indirectly by interrogation, questionnaires, and so forth. It can be examined, studied by examination of behavior in the brain. But I suggest, if I'm wrong, I'm flamboyantly wrong. If we're really interested in the mind, this embodied mind, we should also study it directly through introspection. Look at it. What's the harm? And not simply assume that whatever we assume is going to be somehow wrong. Here's one of my favorite metaphors. I had added the slide today, even though I knew I'd be short of time. It's one of my favorite experiments in modern astronomy. It's rather famous. It's called from the Hubble telescope, the Hubble Ultra Deep Field. It was an experiment, an observation made 2003 to 2004. What the astronomers who were controlling the Hubble telescope, this was its heyday when it was the best telescope out there, going around the planet, right? It's in orbit. The astronomers found a tiny, tiny portion of the sky, about 1/13 of the night sky. If you take a pencil, hold it out at arm's length, the amount of space that the eraser end of the pencil displaces is about that much of the night sky. Tiny, tiny fraction. But from what the astronomers knew thus far, this tiny little dot was dark. It seemed to be the least populated area of the night sky, the low-rent district of the universe. Not much there. And so they thought, well, why don't we I think they must just want to have some fun. And they decided, why don't we make a 1,000,000-second exposure? Turn the Hubble telescope to it. Hubble telescopes, of course, going around the Earth, so they made 400 revolutions of the Hubble telescope around the Earth, and every time it got in the right position, they took a long exposure and then added up a 1,000,000-second exposure of that tiny, tiny fraction of dark space that seemed to be virtually empty, 1/10 of the diameter of the full moon. And when they did that, they processed that and they created a computer-generated image of what was in that little tiny dark spot. Oh, I love this. They discovered 10,000 galaxies. And a galaxy will have anywhere from 500 billion to 1 trillion stars. That's the area where there's little. Other areas more heavily populated. 10,000 galaxies. It doesn't really tell us anything fantastically new about the universe, but they were picking up photons from galaxies for which they got 1 photon a second, and they were able to get an image. It was that sensitive. And it just expands the mind. It just expands the mind to think, gosh, such a vast, vast universe, so heavily populated with galaxies, with stars, and now scientists are suspecting there may be on the average, 1 planet per star, judging by the exoplanets they've discovered so far. So what would it be like? That's only a metaphor, but it's good science. What would it be like to develop refined, honed, sharply focused, high-resolution attention? It's called samadhi. And focus that samadhi not out to the stars, because we have telescopes for that. They're much better than just gazing with your eyes. But turning that samadhi, that telescope of samadhi, and directing that inwards into the space of the mind, the domain of the mind, the domain in which thoughts, images, memories, and so forth arise, and then sustaining that, doing a long exposure. What would it be like to have a million-second long exposure? Probing into the depths of the space of the mind. What would it be like? Has anybody ever done this? Gone into, let's say, a meditation cave or a meditation hut and spent 6 months, a year, 2 years, 3 years meditating, let's say, 12, 14 hours a day. Long, sustained exposure. Exploring in depth. Quieting everything down. Radically simplifying your whole life. So you're not thinking about paying taxes and accounting and the next movie and so forth. You're going for depth. You're leaving everything non-essential behind. What would it be like? And what's been reported, because this has been done. I've spent roughly about 40,000 hours doing this myself. It's interesting. Is contemplatives, and it's drawing primarily from the Buddhist tradition, but it's not uniquely a Buddhist insight. You find it in Hinduism, Taoism, most likely early Christianity. You find it in multiple traditions, where you find it in those traditions where the tradition has a strong tradition of developing samadhi. And what contemplatives have reported, I'm not saying this is true, what I'm saying is true is they did report this. Whether it's true or not, well, let's investigate. Is a natural state, that is when you allow your mind, your conditioned mind, your psyche, your embodied mind to settle down. These contemplatives claim that they've discovered a deeper dimension of consciousness. They call it the substrate consciousness. It's one of many names. Some call it spirit, soul. There are many other words for it. I can give you as a religious studies scholar, there's a lot of terms for it. An underlying subtle continuum of consciousness that is not human. It has no gender, it has no culture, it has no personal history, it has no language. A clear flow of consciousness, substrate consciousness, and when you see it directly through rigorous, sustained meditative training in mindfulness and introspection, you find, possibly to your amazement, that when you're resting in that substrate consciousness, it is by nature blissful, luminous, and still, or non-conceptual. And that's whether you're a Buddhist, you're a Christian, or whatever, it seems to be a discovery. I would claim that it is a discovery. And so here's that second dimension. A primal, this is not God, it's not nirvana, it's not anything mystical or transcendent. It's simply a very primal dimension or flow or continuum of consciousness in which, when you're resting in it, all sensory impressions, which are arising in dependence upon visual cortex, auditory cortices, and so forth, they've all gone dormant. Thoughts, the chit-chat of the mind, dormant. Mental images, the kinetic energy of the mind, the images, memories, and so forth, dormant. And what's left over is just this clear, luminous, pure, blissful flow of consciousness, called the alaya vijnana. And it's said by these contemplatives, this is the ground state of the psyche. And in fact, in the formation of a fetus, consciousness, according to this theory, does not emerge from complex configuration of neurons. That's an interesting theory, never been demonstrated, widely accepted without evidence. And they're saying, well, that's wrong, that there is no minimum amount of neuronal activity that generates consciousness, because chemicals don't generate consciousness. Neurons don't generate consciousness. That's just a belief, but it's never had any evidence to support it. It's simply assumed, because if all you're looking at is at the physical, which is what scientists study, where else would you think consciousness would come from? You can say God, but that doesn't help you. If you say non-physical, that doesn't help you because you don't know what you're talking about. So you say, well, it must come from what we know about, and neurons are the best suspect. But maybe it's not true. According to this theory, the activities of the mind, different modes of consciousness, sensory consciousness, the activities arising in dependence upon the frontal cortex and so forth, they actually emerge from this primal state of consciousness and they're conditioned by the brain, but they don't arise from the brain. In other words, it's a very different hypothesis. This one can be tested. You can test to see whether people, whether children, meditators, and so forth, going very deep, whether they can tap into any memories that preceded this lifetime. It's an open question. And now there's more and more evidence. I'm watching it quite closely when people have near-death experiences, when they have cardiac arrest and they're dead for a few minutes, totally flatlined. Is there any ongoing continuity of individual experience? That's a fair question. The evidence is becoming more and more difficult to ignore. If it is, it changes everything. That this subtle continuum is not contingent upon the brain. It precedes this life, it follows this life. I'm offering this not as a religious believer wanting to convert you, because I have no such interest. But I am interested to see that science throws off the shackles of dogmatism, because it's betraying its own heritage when it does that. It's betraying Galileo. And that concerns me because I love science. Is there anything beyond that? We're almost wrapped up, and I think pretty close on time. Almost. I'll be finished very quickly here. Is there anything beyond that? This is an individual continuum of consciousness. It's not a cosmic consciousness. It's not God. It's not Atman. It's just a continuum of consciousness that, according to this theory, carries on from lifetime to lifetime and gets configured as a woman's mind, a man's mind, an Australian mind, and so on, maybe even an animal's mind. That was the view of Pythagoras, by the way, who said he could recall 20 of his previous lifetimes, according to ancient legend. Is there anything beyond this dimension of primal consciousness that is individual? And there, we find again in multiple traditions, Christian, Sufi, Taoist, Buddhist, Hindu, multiple traditions. Contemplatives in many traditions are pointing to something beyond that. A dimension of consciousness that is truly transcendent, ultimate, luminous, an empty ground state of consciousness that is all-pervasive, pervading space and time, pervading all the phenomena, and is non-dual, non-local, atemporal, and it's non-dual from an absolute space, some kind of a hyperspace, an ultimate dimension of space itself. That does sound mystical, and it is. But if, and I say this only as if, it's not an argument, I'm simply saying this is what's reported. If this is something that keeps on cropping up in multiple traditions with very different ideologies, Islam is very different from Buddhism, Buddhism is very different from Christianity, and so on. But if we find contemplatives who are probing to that depth and finding they're reporting something that sounds awfully similar, then that at least should, I think, give one pause. Maybe there's something to it. Maybe these are scientists using different laboratories and different conceptual frameworks and discovering something similar. So we should be skeptical. Scientists, if they're not skeptical, they're not good scientists. But they should be skeptical of their own assumptions, not only the assumptions of others. And so Richard Feynman, one of the great theoretical physicists of the late 20th century, he sums this up very well. We're almost finished. But I've never seen it articulated better than he has done. He was a hardcore materialist, incredibly brilliant physicist, eminent scientist at Caltech, and he writes, and I'm going to read it because it's juicy. He says it better than anybody else I've seen. It is only through refined measurements and careful experimentation that we can have a wider vision. In other words, not just thinking brilliant thoughts, not just doing what Copernicus did. That was brilliant thoughts. It was Galileo. And then, after we've made these refined measurements and careful experimentation, then we see unexpected things. We see things that are far from what we would guess, far from what we could have imagined. That's the beauty of empiricism. If science is to progress, what we need is the ability to experiment, honesty in reporting results. The results must be reported without somebody saying what they would like the results to have been. And one of the ways of stopping science would be only to do experiments in the region where you know the law, where you feel comfortable, studying behavior, studying brain. But experimenters research most diligently and with the greatest effort in exactly those places where it seems most likely that we can prove our theories wrong. I'd like to know that the experimenters, I don't think they got tenure. It's tough. To ask for a grant to study evidence that might overturn the apple cart, overturn assumptions. It's hard to get grants for that. It's hard to get money. Play it safe. If you've just come out of graduate school, you have a fresh Ph.D., and you say, I'd like to study paranormal psychology, you may as well just take a gun to your head and say, I want to die right now. You'll not get grants, but you'll not get a job either, most likely. You're treading on thin ice. I've heard this so many times. Go safe. Get tenure. Better get a Nobel Prize, and then do that after you're retired. That's the safe way. But not when you're 30 years old trying to start a career. Don't do anything out there on the fringe that might do what Richard Feynman says all scientists should do. Experimenters, these ideal experimenters, search most diligently and with the greatest effort in exactly those places where it seems most likely that we can prove our theories wrong. In other words, we're trying to prove ourselves wrong as quickly as possible, because only in that way can we find progress. I want to stand up and give him standing ovation for that, because I wish it happened more. That's dangerous. Churches want to protect their power. They've done that always. And now the churches are scientific institutions, academia, universities, and so forth. They've got power, they've got money, and the last thing you want is flaming revolutionaries, making them look like idiots. Did scientists invent skepticism? Direct quote from the Buddha, very often quoted. He's presented as a religious leader, right? And the Buddha said, widely quoted, especially in the Tibetan tradition, monks, he's addressing his own followers, he says, just as the wise accept gold after testing it by heating, cutting, and rubbing it, test it to see whether it's gold or fool's gold, so are my words to be accepted after examining them, but not out of respect for me. So he never said, oh, ye of little faith. I have no criticism of Jesus, but Buddha never said that. You should believe it, because look, I'm Buddha. He never said that. He said, no, check for yourself. And if my words are true, then the more deeply you investigate them, the truer they will appear. And if I say something that's false, the more carefully you investigate it, the more false it will appear. And then you should disband it, discard it. That's Buddha 2,500 years ago. Great skeptic. He was very skeptical of many, many beliefs of his time. Dalai Lama, he's my teacher. Definitely I have a subjective bias for him, but here's a statement he's made many, many times, which is some modification of phrasing. He says, a general basic stance of Buddhism is that it is inappropriate to hold a view that is logically inconsistent. Reason is a very high priority in Buddhism. This is taboo. Be coherent, be rational, use reason. But he said it's even more taboo than holding a view that is logically inconsistent, is holding a view that goes against direct experience. In my reading, I'm going to go a little bit over, sorry, but I was astonished about 6 months ago. I really was astonished. And I've been studying philosophy of mind and psychology for some years now. But I read an article in the New York Times. You can find it. Just Google, are we really conscious? It'll come up. Written by a distinguished neuroscientist at Princeton University. Title of the paper, published there on New York Times online, is, Are We Really Conscious? As you may suspect, given that I'm mentioning it right now, his answer was, no. There's no mind-body problem because there's no such thing as subjective experience. Daniel Dennett, eminent philosopher, one of the two greatest, most foremost in America, says the same thing. We are mindless robots made up of mindless robots. Michio Kaku, a very distinguished physicist, says the same thing in The Future of the Mind. There's no mind-body problem because there's no mind. Your thermostat is the most primitive cognitive organism. If these people were in an insane asylum, I would understand. But these are distinguished people. A Princeton neuroscientist, Michio Kaku, a very fine physicist and wonderfully articulate. Daniel Dennett, he's the poster child among philosophers. The neuroscientists, psychologists love him. And he's saying that all subjective experience doesn't exist. There's no such thing as qualia. Qualia don't exist, where qualia are the contents of our subjective experience. Okay. That's a view that goes against direct experience. And that is, if you can read Michael Graziano, the neuroscientist from Princeton, if you can read and understand his hypothesis, you've refuted it. And the New York Times published it anyway. So I know there are religious quacks that are called the New Earth people. They believe that the Earth is less than 10,000 years old. It's really silly, right? Something like 30% of Americans believe that, apparently. Gives me the creeps. But that's flat out silly, isn't it? To think the Earth is less than 10,000 years old? I mean, really, brain dead silly? Which is sillier? The notion that the Earth is less than 10,000 years, or the notion that you're not conscious at all? Which is sillier? This is a violation of science, presented as science, and it makes me very sad. So it's high time, I'm suggesting, last slide, wrap it up. We haven't had a first revolution in the mind sciences, maybe because we haven't followed the lead of Galileo and the lead of Darwin and the lead of William James. We haven't been carefully examining, let alone Hubble telescope million-second exposure examining, the mind in the only way it can be observed. You can't observe it with technology. You see brain, you see behavior, you do not see. You do not observe, detect, measure subjective experience. Never have been able to, maybe in the future, but not now. So why don't we implement rigorous, sustained training in first-person, contemplative methods, not to displace, not to be in combat with, but to complement the wonderful array of third-person scientific methods for studying the mind indirectly. And explore not just the ordinary psyche of normal people and brain-damaged people and people with mental illness, which is the primary focus of psychology nowadays, but study the broadest possible range of states of consciousness, in integrating the methods of psychology, neuroscience, and contemplation. Why not? Where's the downside? Who's going to lose anything? It's not a winner-take-all. It's not like, oh, the contemplatives win and the scientists lose. It's rather combining complementary skills to come to a three-dimensional understanding of the mind, which we've never done in the West since the time of William James. And in so doing, and here's a personal pitch, we should create a network of contemplative observatories for training professional contemplatives in collaborative research with professionally trained scientists and philosophers. In other words, as we have neuroscience labs, we have psychology labs, we should also have contemplative labs, where people don't just go for a retreat for a week or a month or a year, but they actually received rigorous, sustained, highly professional training in close collaboration with scientists all the way through, and they put in 10,000 hours, 20,000 hours. And then they conjoin with the scientists who are so good at studying brain and behavior, which contemplatives are not, and say, look, we've got our blind spot, you have your blind spot, you have your eye, we have our eye, why don't we get the two eyes together and have a three-dimensional vision? No competition, but just recognize science doesn't have all the answers, although it pretends to on occasion, or at least our way is the only way, which is kind of religious fundamentalism with a different name, and contemplatives don't have the only way. 2,500 years of Buddhism, there's no brain science in Buddhism at all. We missed something. Whoops, the brain. Because the brain function doesn't become very evident when you meditate. Meditate 40,000 hours, you still won't know what a hippocampus is. So there's a complementarity there, and that's the invitation. And so I'm actually working right now with a group in India, in Bangalore, in Sikkim, another group in Tuscany, in Italy, another group in my hometown of Santa Barbara, other people in Australia, Brazil, Mexico, and Mongolia, to create a whole network of contemplative observatories where the welcome mat is out from the very beginning, inviting scientists. We're not here to prove Buddhism or contemplatives are best. We're here to introduce another mode of inquiry into the mind in full-scale collaboration with behavioral psychologists, cognitive philosophers, and so forth, to try to bring this together in an open-minded, ecumenical, utterly non-sectarian, radically empirical, non-dogmatic way. Yeehaw! That's the end of my talk. I hope it was useful. We've been having a 3-day seminar, meditation seminar. Tomorrow will be the last day of that, where we're focusing on something quite simple. Let's say you're focusing on sensations of the breath. And that's where your mindfulness is focused. Mindfulness in this Buddhist context means you're able to bear in mind, your hold in mind without forgetfulness, without distraction. You're able to sustain that flow of deliberate, sustained attention, right? But you can also not only be aware of the sensations of the breath, but you can also monitor your attention of the breath. We all know this. You know when you become distracted. And you know when you're spacing out. Now you know retrospectively. While you're distracted, so you don't know you're distracted, but you can quickly, retrospectively, in a matter of milliseconds, maybe 30 or 50 milliseconds, you could recognize, my mind was wandering. And you pick that up with introspection, that monitoring, metacognition, metacognitive monitoring of the flow of attention. We all know we can do that. We know when we're spaced out, when we know we're bored, we know when we're excited, agitated, or distracted, but it's retrospective, maybe again 30, 50 milliseconds, and then we're aware, I saw my mind has become dull. I see my mind was distracted, and then we bring it back on course. And so in that very moment, let's now get down to let's say, little bursts of, let's say, 30 milliseconds of cognition, roughly the shortest duration in which we can actually know something. Isn't it correct? Something 25, 30 milliseconds of ascertaining something you can report on. Let's imagine that that's the briefest period in which you can actually know something. Maybe it's shorter, but it's probably order of magnitude right. It's not 3 milliseconds, and it's not 300. Order of magnitude pretty good, 30 milliseconds. Let's imagine that's it. During those 30 milliseconds of being inattentive, you're not aware that you're inattentive, because if you were, you wouldn't be inattentive. But can we be aware that we were just inattentive? After 30 seconds, in the next 30 milliseconds, not 30 seconds, 30 milliseconds, can you be aware, oh yeah, I was spacing out, but now I'm back? The answer is yes. And so this is a crucial aspect of meditative training, to not only utilize but refine your metacognitive or introspective ability so that you recognize very swiftly when you've fallen into either laxity, lack of clarity, and so on, or whether you've fallen into agitation, distraction, the dispersion of attention. So exactly simultaneous, no, but can you bring it close? Now this goes right up in our seminar this morning. I won't reiterate much, but can we be aware of our desires? Can we be aware of our desires, only follow them? Of course we can be aware of our desires. If you see some very attractive person or some delicious dessert for which you'd like to have seconds and thirds, you can see, oh, I'd really like more of that. I'd like to overeat, it tastes so good. So we can be aware of our desires. We don't have to watch our behavior. We can sense a desire coming up. We can also metacognitively observe our emotions coming up. I'm feeling depressed, I'm getting bored, I'm getting listless, I'm getting very anxious, I'm getting very angry, I'm getting very upset, and so forth, right? But here's the catch once again, and this goes back to William James and Buddhism equally, because they say the same thing, and then I'll stop. And that is, in that first moment of a desire, let's say it's for the remaining juice here, say, oh, I'm still a bit thirsty, maybe I can find a cup, oh, it's over there, I think I'd like some. And so the desire comes up, and in the first moment, let's say the first millisecond, 30 milliseconds, that desire, I'd like more juice. In that moment, I'm not aware that I'm desiring. What I'm aware of is the juice. I want it. But after that, the desire may come up, and before I'm reaching for the juice, I may be retrospectively aware that a desire has arisen, and now I can make a decision. Do I want to act on it, or better maybe wait until this gathering is finished, and I can have a sip afterwards? So the awareness of desire is retrospective. 30 seconds, 50 seconds, 100 milliseconds, and then we recognize it, but not in the moment. And likewise for an emotion. If I'm feeling anxious of somebody, and maybe I see somebody pull out a gun, I say, what did you bring a gun to the university for? Have you heard about me? You know. And so the anxiety comes up as I see the gun. In that moment, I'm not aware I'm anxious. I'm aware of the gun, and it's scaring me. And then I may be aware of the anxiety around it, and I look closer, and it's a toy gun. Because a person's going to use that as a demonstration of some psychological experiment. And so whether it's an emotion, whether it's a desire, in that first burst of the desire or the emotion that has a referent, I want this, I'm afraid of that gun, oh, it's a toy gun, I'm not afraid any longer. In that first moment, we're not aware of the desire or the emotion. We're aware of what we're emoting about or desiring. But then before we act on the emotion or express the emotion or the desire, we may become metacognitively aware of the desire and then decide, shall I act upon it or not? So the whole question is simultaneity. Well, not quite simultaneous, but pretty close. So in terms of mindfulness now, very briefly, modern and more traditional notions of mindfulness. Jon Kabat-Zinn, who is the founder of mindfulness-based stress reduction, a very dear man, and he's done, I think, amazingly good work in the world, he has coined a definition. It's actually not a Buddhist definition, but it's a very useful one. Mindfulness as this moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness of whatever comes up. Very useful definition. That's all we can ever hope of a definition, is it's useful. Not that it's right or wrong. Is it useful or not? If it's not useful, it won't be used anymore, right? So that's a definition that's become very widely accepted in psychology, in the business world, and in medical facilities all over the world. Very useful. It's also limited, because that's not useful in all circumstances to be aware of whatever comes up when you need to be really focused. You don't really want to be aware of equally of everything coming up. You want to be focusing on here and now. But the Buddhist definition, which has been around not for 50 years, but for about 1500, is what I said before, this faculty of attending to something with which we're familiar, bearing it in mind, without forgetfulness, without distraction. And so it's different, but not mutually exclusive. And that is, if I decide I have some moment of leisure, some quiet time, a time to meditate, and I'd like to simply sit quietly, perhaps with my eyes closed, and practice what they call open monitoring, open presence, simply being present. Ram Dass, 50 years ago, be here now, former psychology professor at Harvard. And just be quiet and be totally present with whatever comes up. And breathe in, breathe out, and just let whatever arises, thoughts, images, sounds, tactile sensations, and just be present with whatever comes up. That's very helpful for countering rumination, mind wandering, because it brings you right in the present moment without all the overlays of judgments, preferences, beliefs, subjective bias of all kind. It's helpful to cut through that, and it's been very, very helpful, especially for reducing stress. Because when we are getting stressed out, we tend to be caught up in rumination, in mind wandering. That's very stressful, and it's been found stress is bad for everything. Not good for anything at all, excess stress. So there's the usefulness of that. That is a type of mindfulness in the Buddhist sense, because I'm choosing now to be aware of something with which I'm familiar, and that is sensory impressions of all kinds arising. And now I'm making the decision, I want to sustain this flow of mindful presence with respect to whatever comes up, really an open monitoring, excluding nothing, editing out nothing, being totally present with everything that comes up, and I shall bear this in mind, sustain this flow of mindful presence without forgetfulness, without just going off into a spin cycle of distracting thoughts and so forth, or just spacing out, and without distraction, being caught up and carried away by rumination. I will sustain this flow of mindful presence, open, not judgmental, very much in the moment. So that mindfulness as how do you say, as defined in the contemporary context, is one facet of mindfulness as defined in the classical context in Buddhism. But it's not the only type of mindfulness. Because if you're sitting down to listen to a lecture, maybe it's one for which you'll be graded, maybe you're sitting for your comprehensive examinations and you better know this stuff, then you don't want moment-to-moment awareness of whatever comes up, like the fly buzzing around your head and the attractive person over there and the twinge in your knee. Then it wouldn't be very useful. So there are times when we want to be very focused. When you're driving in heavy traffic, you don't want moment-to-moment awareness of whatever's coming up. You want to actually not collide with the car in front of you and so forth. And so mindfulness is actually much more, applicable in a wide variety of situations, the classical definition. But when you have some leisure, you're not driving in heavy traffic, you're not working on a business plan, you're not composing music, you're not working on a scientific theory, you have a bit of leisure, then you can throttle back and practice moment-to-moment awareness, not judgmentally of whatever comes up. When it's back to work, you better learn how to focus your attention. It is, as a Buddhist scholar, practitioner, former Buddhist monk, I was a monk for 14 years, I am concerned when people make false claims that are totally unnecessary. And it happens a lot in the mindfulness movement. When I hear people that I respect, and they're very nice people, saying this moment-to-moment, non-judgmental awareness, this is the essence of all of Buddhist meditation. That's just not true. I don't know why they it's just PR. It's just marketing. It's false advertising. I wish they wouldn't say that. They don't need to. They don't need to say this is the essence of all of Buddhism without the Buddhism. They don't need to say this is Buddhism without any of the mumbo-jumbo. They don't need that. That's pejorative, it's ignorant, and it's just flat out false, and it's not helping anybody. Because what they have is something really good. They published an article, and the title they gave was, "Mindfulness is not snake oil." That was a quote from me. The mindfulness movement, as with John Kabat-Zinn and Sharon Salzberg and many others, it's good, it's helpful. It doesn't need to be over-marketed. They don't need to make any exaggerated claims. It's good for what it is. It's not Buddhism, it's not the essence of Buddhism, it's not even the Buddhist definition of mindfulness. It's compatible with Buddhism, but also a concern here. And John Kabat-Zinn has been a friend of mine, I think I said, for 25 years now. He's a very dear friend. I respect him and feel great affection for him, admiration for him as well. And what he has done, he and his colleagues, and it's worldwide now, is they've taken a practice like mindfulness of breathing, they've plucked it out of the context of Buddhism, which is profoundly, fundamentally ethical in its orientation, rooted in ahimsa, nonviolence, and in benevolence, those two. That basically all of Buddhist ethics is around nonviolence and benevolence. They've taken it out of that context, out of the entire worldview, and brought it into a stress reduction clinic, and taught it to people who have no interest in Buddhism or in meditation or in anything, any kind of religion at all. They're just stressed out, unhappy, physically miserable, and they'd like some help. This was skillful means. I have no criticism. They've taken entirely out of the context of Buddhism, brought it into the context of a stress reduction lab or clinic, and they're helping people by the thousands and thousands and thousands. And that's very good. That is, they weren't asking for an intro course on Buddhist meditation. You come to a Buddhist center for that, right? And so it was decontextualized, and it was, how do you say, the ethics of Buddhism was taken out of that. You just hope that people have their own ethics, Christian or humanist or Jewish or whatever, but they didn't come to the stress reduction class or clinic to learn about ethics. Fair enough. You don't go to the dentist to learn about ethics either. You just want your teeth fixed, and they would like their stress reduced. Fair enough. But this is why I'm concerned when it said this is the essence of all of Buddhist meditation, because the definition I gave is of mindfulness simply as a mental factor. And I gave the definition a couple of times. But there's also in Buddhism, this is mainstream and is universal in all schools of Buddhism, there's also something called right mindfulness in the Eightfold Noble Path. Right mindfulness, I think a better translation is authentic mindfulness. And when you see this now, mindfulness is integral to following a spiritual path. Spiritual maturation, the alleviation of mental afflictions, greater freedom, and eventually freedom from samsara, you know? And so mindfulness, right mindfulness, authentic mindfulness is something more than simply the mental factor of mindfulness. And right mindfulness is something to be cultivated that will take you to greater virtue, greater well-being, greater awakening, wisdom and compassion, is something in which a quality of a faculty of the mind that absolutely embodies or includes ethics. Ethics. So mindfulness here, and if you wanted to see the source, look in the Milinda Panya by Nagasena. It's right there. What is mindfulness? And he lays it out. Mindfulness is this monitoring of states of mind and recognizing which are wholesome, which are not wholesome, which are beneficial, which are unbeneficial. And the yogi, the contemplative, the person who's cultivating, practicing right mindfulness, adopts the wholesome ones and releases the unwholesome ones. And that is, if you have some impulse to rob somebody, to be sarcastic, contemptuous, to deceive somebody, to manipulate somebody, you see that impulse coming up, you recognize it discerningly, and you see, aha, that would not be helpful to the world for me to manifest that in speech or in behavior. I'm going to let that one go. But here is an act of kindness, of benevolence. This is an impulse coming up. I'll let that one out. You know? So when you have swine flu, you can quarantine yourself, and when your mind's really healthy, your body's really healthy, then you go out for a dance. You know, but you don't dance when you have swine flu. And so that's right mindfulness, where ethics is built in. And one needn't believe in God or creation or karma or rebirth to implement that notion of ethics, because one, even within this life, in this lifetime, one can see with a ordinary degree of intelligence, if I should behave in such a way, is this likely to be hurtful, inflict unnecessary harm, or is this likely to be helpful, benevolent, kind, or at least neutral? You don't have to be, religious to have a sense of conscience, a sense of good sense. That if I speak in such a way, will this be offensive? Do I stand by my statement? I do not believe there has been a revolution in the mind sciences comparable to that of Darwin or of Galileo. Yes, I stand by that. But I hasten to add, so much knowledge, especially the last 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, the technology getting so much better, and the Buddhists have no technology at all. So we're not competing. But then, in modern science, as far as I know, over the last 100 years, I don't know of any great progress in developing introspective skills in modern psychology. If it's there, I'd really like to know about it, then I'll stop saying this. But I know somebody who's chair of psychology at a major research university in the United States, and he's a Buddhist, he's a Zen Buddhist, and he tried to introduce introspection into the curriculum in psychology, like Psychology 101, that students would also be trained to observe their own mental states. Not Zen or Buddhism or reincarnation, just, learn how to introspect. And the faculty voted him down, said, no, we don't want that. That's not scientific. So I will love to see in my lifetime, that shift. I'm not wanting to introduce religious dogma into psychology, but rather a spirit of empiricism that doesn't insist that the only data are objective, physical, and quantifiable. So, final point is another wonderful movement of the last 15 years, really, it was millennial, is Martin Seligman and others starting this whole movement of positive psychology. And they're raising really, really good questions. What is authentic happiness? What is exceptional mental health? And so Barbara Fredrickson is one of the shining lights in this field. One of the most brilliant people, intelligent, creative people working in this field of positive psychology. And she wrote a book that I guess her publisher sent me. I don't know quite why, but I got a free copy several years back. It's a book called Positivity. Positivity. It's all about positive psychology, of course. And well into the book, she had a chart of attributes of positivity and attributes of negativity. So attributes of positive psychology and then the antithesis. And I looked through, I think it was 11 qualities of positivity. There's ingredients of positive psychology, genuine happiness, the good stuff, exceptional mental health. And what really caught my attention is I read through the 11, each one of them, and then I saw the opposite with the negativities, of course. And the positivities, I looked by one, and then I imagined myself as an Al-Qaeda operative planning the next blowing up of innocent people. And lo and behold, I could fulfill all 11 criteria. The sense of connectedness, greater meaning, vision, and so community, and so forth and so on. I'll be right with you. And I thought, whoa, I could be full of positivity and be ready to blow up another building and kill thousands of innocent people. And I wrote to her and I said, is that really what you intended? That you can have a very positive psyche and you can still use that to engage in active terrorism? There's no ethics there at all. At all. And she didn't write back. That was disappointing. But I understand from friends of mine who are reading her still, because I'm not, is that it's making its way in, that ethics is coming into positive psychology. And I think it's a wonderful thing. It's a young discipline, and it's growing, maturing, and the more ethics is brought in, not dogmatic, but radically empirical, that the way we behave with our body, speech, and mind influences our own mental states, our own mental health, as well as the well-being of those around us. And we don't have to be judgmental, moralistic, or metaphysical to go there. And ethics should be brought into science and not excluded because it has the odor of religion.
To me, anyway, I thought it was the attentional and the orientational component that was important in mindfulness to cultivate compassion and
There are forms of meditation. In fact, I taught one today, a practice called settling the mind into natural state. It's a traditional practice, been around for at least 1,000 years, and it entails observing discerningly, intelligently, clearly, vigilantly, single-pointedly, whatever's coming up in the mind, emotions, desires, thoughts, and so forth, but doing so without being judgmental, without editing, censoring, feeling bad, cringing, adopting, and so forth, just being totally present, totally present. It's a very specific type of meditation. It's one of hundreds, right? And that is a type of very discerning, highly intelligent, non-judgmental. So I asked John Kabat-Zinn years ago, this word non-judgmental is coming up everywhere. It's kind of like equated with mindfulness, that if you're mindful, you mean non-judgmental. But I asked John, what do you mean by that? Because, it's an odd word in English. And that is if I point to you and say, you're being very judgmental. That's pejorative. Everybody knows that's pejorative. Oh, you say, why do you say that? You have to get on the defensive. Whereas if I say you're exercising very good judgment, you're exercising very sound judgment, that's praise. So the noun's good and the adjective's bad. That's strange. So I asked John, what do you mean by that, non-judgmental? Because it's so strongly emphasized. He said, what I mean by that is that as you're attending to whatever's coming up in the mind, whatever's happening in the world, you suspend, you hold back the tendency to project, I like it, I don't like it. All the I like, I don't like it. Just be, hey, it's happening. Be present with it. Without slapping on attractive, unattractive, I like, I don't like, and so forth. Just be there with whatever it is, without being judgmental about it. And I said, well, I can accept that. That sounds really good to me. Now my concern comes in, is one of the major measurements, the scientific measurement, I think it's called MAAS, M-A-A-S. I was appalled when I was looking at this measurement. It's a classic measurement. And you check it. I think you're very familiar with it. There's one whole category. I've cited in one of my books called Meditations of a Buddhist Skeptic, where it's asking, are you ever, I can only paraphrase here. It's like 10 questions. Do you ever evaluate your own perceptions? Do you ever evaluate? It was saying, exercise no discernment, no discrimination, no judgment whatsoever. Whatever comes up, just embrace it. And I'm thinking, this is the trajectory to be a moral imbecile. No judgment whatsoever. And we can make perceptions that are totally false. We can make assumptions totally false. Speculations totally false. And this was saying, no, don't be judgmental. And I'm saying, no, don't be judgmental. Be intelligent. Be discerning. And so one can be non-judgmental. We know that's good, be non-judgmental, but at the same time we can be discerning. And that's the Buddhist definition of right mindfulness. It didn't say be judgmental, but recognize not all impulses are created equal. Some of our emotions are destructive. Some of our desires are crazy. Be careful what you wish for, you may get it. And so to develop discernment, to monitor in a discerning fashion, here's a desire coming up, but I'm going to release that one. It's not going to be helpful. Here's an emotion I'd love to express, but he's going to be offended, and it's just going to create more conflict. He'll be pissed off. He'll get back at me. So why don't I just not do that? And so it's actually good sense. It's as good sense as going to a cafeteria where they have a lot of food and not choosing food that you know is unhealthy. So the food is being dished up. We don't eat everything indiscriminately. And the mind dishes up all kinds of desires and emotions. And we shouldn't gobble them up indiscriminately. But see, this one I adopt and this one I release. But, I think I do understand. Because John's such a good man. If you know him personally, he's just an incredibly nice man. Intelligent, caring, compassionate. I will just say he's a good man. He's not socially or ethically irresponsible in any way. And I've known him for at least 25 years. And I think what he's addressing here is issues of low self-esteem, lack of self-worth, self-hatred, self-loathing are very, very common. And I've known a number of people who have this, and it's debilitating. The repercussions of bearing in a chronic fashion a sense of low self-esteem, a lack of self-worth, don't even like yourself. It's crippling. And where does it come from? By being so judgmental with respect to one's own behavior, one's thoughts, attitudes, beliefs, and so forth, that you're just like a really stern, intolerant parent. Never you're giving yourself a break. And that if we're intolerant, judgmental towards ourselves, how are we going to avoid doing that towards other people? That's a very powerful tendency. And this big, strong emphasis, cool it. Be very attentive, be very mindful, watch closely. But why don't you release that tendency? And whatever's coming up, recognize, hey, they're just desires, they're just emotions, they're not you. They're not intrinsically yours. You don't need to judge them. You don't need to feel bad about them. Or feel low self-esteem because you have some desires, emotions that you feel are not appropriate. Just recognize them and relax. And when you recognize other people's behavior as not so appropriate, you don't have to be judgmental, relax. So I think he's addressing a very important issue, but it can be oversold. Once again, exercise no discernment, no discrimination, no intelligence whatsoever. Embrace it all because it's all part of you. And that's New Age, slappy-dappy, hippy-dippy rubbish.
I very much support the idea of developing a scientific approach to contemplative states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And also very much the idea that we need to go beyond just describing brains and
Yeah.
behavior and to look at those things from a participant's perspective.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then again, that's not so simple.
No, it's not simple.
So I was wondering if in our strategy to approach that, if you wouldn't find it wise on the first hand to try to incorporate the wisdom of all those people in the West who have actually opposed the idea, because I think there is some wisdom there. Many of the arguments against introspection have really been arguments against the idea of substantivating subjective states.
What do you mean by that?
Like Wittgenstein's arguments against privileged access to my own internal states, which are in many ways very, very parallel to Nagarjuna's arguments against the positive exists.
I'd like to ask you a favor, because there's some people I've not been able to fathom. Daniel Dennett's one. I know he's intelligent, and I've never been able to imagine an intelligent interpretation of his statement that subjective experience doesn't exist, that quality don't exist. And so when you say there's no privilege, when Wittgenstein says, and he's a brilliant philosopher, we all know that, but when he says there's no such thing as privileged access to one's own meditative states, you tell me, please, what type of fruit am I imagining right now? I'm imagining right now a type of fruit. What type of fruit?
A good choice would be apples. That's just the paradigmatic.
I think you were guessing, Penis. But you see, of course I have privileged access. I know what I was thinking, and you were guessing because apples are pretty common fruit. But it could have been guava. How would you know? You're just guessing, and I know definitively it was guava or wasn't guava. How can we say that's not privileged access?
Yeah.
I would really love to see an intelligent way to interpret what he just said, and I can't see it.
Well, I mean, what Wittgenstein's point is really about is the question of the existence of such a state without support of the intersubjectivity of language. So that we are actually training with language the ability to gradually grasp and put expression to something which happens inside.
I'm going to delve into your area. I've heard research, and correct me if I'm wrong, that if I understood wrong, but during the last trimester of a fetus inside the mother's womb, I've heard, based upon neurophysiological evidence, that during that last trimester, when the brain is quite well developed, that the unborn baby can distinguish between its mother's voice and the voice of someone else. So I've heard. Yeah? Now, I think it's safe to assume that this baby who's not even out of the womb yet is prelingual. Doesn't have any language at all. And yet recognizes mother's voice versus somebody else's voice. So how can we say the experience is always filtered through language when this prelingual baby can recognize this versus that and has no language whatsoever?
Well, even in that case, even in that case, it has to be mediated through some kind of expression.
Who's the baby expressing to? If this isn't privileged access.
Even to be able to make the distinction, to be able to recognize that the baby makes a distinction. That needs to be expressed somehow.
Obviously, this is a debate that won't end tonight. But I'm really simply trying to make intelligible Wittgenstein, and at that point I'm not succeeded.
The birthday party is almost over. And I want, as the last sentence, to say thank you very much to the Center of Medfølelse, Visdom and Medfølelse. To all the frivillige who have done a fantastic job, to Martin and to the audience, to you and to me.
And I'll have a last word. So, science should be fun. Philosophy should be fun. I've had fun tonight. I hope you have too.
Yeah. Vi skal bede om at tage jeres kopper med ud.